All right,
Eric
we're
has his
recording.
hand up. All right. Welcome to the March 2001 meeting of the Central Florida Astronomical Society. Meeting via Zoom again because of course, the worldwide pandemic. As I saw some chatter on Facebook earlier today, as uh, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Perhaps by the end of the year, we'll be meeting in person again at the planetarium as more and more of our members uh, are more comfortable meeting in person, and the world gets vaccinated and all that sort of thing. Then we'll, you know, some semblance of return to normality. And that's actually, I'm just going to quit talking about that. We'll get back together again when we can get back together again, and we all want it to happen as soon as possible. So today, tonight's meeting, after announcements, we have a very exciting program by Dr. Graham Lowe about life beyond Earth. How can we detect life outside of Earth based on what we know about what life does on Earth? Then we have our mini programs. We'll start off with mini astrophoto with our member astrophoto showcase, of course. Then Mauricio is going to talk about some new dark sky stuff, and Elaine Fisher is going to also take some Q&A about it. I'll probably could just kind of merge that into one mini program with the two of them playing tag team. I'm going to spend just a minute on the moon, if you'll allow. And finally, we'll talk about calculating the equinox with John Pinto. In way of announcements, the new website is live. We gave you a preview last month's meeting, but it's up now, cfas.org. It's live. Spread the news. Tweet it, Instagram it, put it on Facebook. Let the world know. Special thanks goes out to our board members at large who have been updating the wiki. I've seen quite a few emails about wiki updates on Groups.io as more of the the archival type material, and things about our membership and um, rules and things like that get put on the wiki, and some curation of good YouTube videos on amateur astronomy as well. A good segue into that is just to remind you that Groups.io is our primary means of distributing information about CFAS. We do have a presence on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram, of course, but the main hub is going to be Groups.io. And if you remember, you can request access and get on without any problems. Other things to announce: we still have some Observer Guide. We have two of the Observer Guide books left over for $23. We have 5 of the Astronomy League calendars. They're $17. And if you want one, give me a note or something. Send me a note at my email address here, or via president@cfas.org. However you want to get a hold of me. Just don't call me at 3 in the morning. Uh, Friendly monthly reminders. If you have some Astrophotos, send them to Sharife so she can use them for our social media efforts. Also, of course, every month we do a member showcase. We didn't get as many this month, probably because some people did not notice that Derek was not going to be here tonight and you needed to email them to me. But we do have a few, and we like to showcase both our members' astrophotography and their sketches, and that's a regular mini program that we do after our main speaker. Also, if you're doing any outreach or impromptu outreach, or you just sit up in the driveway and, oh, there was a flash crowd, let Lynn know, because that counts as an outreach activity for CFAS, and we do get credit for that. Lynn would appreciate that, and so do we. Finally, coming up this month, tomorrow is an astrophotography webinar. Mark Gillette is going to be hosting at 7:30. And is Mark on? Let me just browse real quick through the attendees. If he wants to say something, I would be okay with that. I don't see his name. All right, well, tune in to Groups.io or ask on Groups.io or check on Facebook for information on his astrophotography tomorrow. Um, Also, there is an impromptu Messier marathon happening this weekend at Lake Seminole Glider Port. I do not actually know if it's Friday or Saturday. Lynn Warren is curating that. He does have a maximum head count of 10, and he's already got a couple of people signed up. If Lynn, if you're on here, you can interrupt at any time to let me know if it's like tomorrow or Saturday. This is great. I love being able to look through and see who's on here. And I don't see Lynn. He may join us later. If he does, somebody remind me before the meeting's over.
Richard, we're aiming for Saturday, I believe.
Saturday. Okay.
Yeah,
So
the weather's it's actually looking better than it was before. I need to double check with Astrospherics, but
okay, great. So Saturday is going to be the day for the Messier Marathon. I'll be interested to hear if we have any diehards who go from dusk till dawn and bag all of them. That'd be pretty good. All right, so that's enough. I have talked long enough. It's time for our main program. I'm going to let Tricia introduce our speaker, and then when he's ready, I'll let him do his screen share and I will drop out and we'll let him talk for a while.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome, everyone. So tonight we are lucky enough to have Dr. Graham Lau speaking with us. A little bit about Dr. Lau. He is an astrobiologist and communicator of science. With an academic background spanning biology, chemistry, astrophysics, and geology, Dr. Lau is an expert on how living things affect the environment around them and how we search for alien life beyond the Earth. He serves as the Director of Communications and Marketing for Blue Marble Space, as a research scientist with the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science, as a Director of Logistics for the University Rover Challenge, also a Dr. Zubrin venture, and as the host of the NASA-funded show, Ask an Astrobiologist. I'm going to post his website in the chat here so you guys can all follow him and check out his social media. So without further ado, let's all welcome Dr. Lau.
Thank you very much, Tricia. I appreciate that. And I will steal this. Can the host allow me to share my screen?
Stand by one, Houston.
Yes. The answer is yes. Whoever finds the button first.
All right, I think I have it now.
There we go. We see it.
All right, awesome. It's always a pleasure to talk to astronomy clubs because you guys are almost always space nerds like I am, and you've looked at the night sky and you've wondered, what else is out there and are we alone? And I'll talk tonight a little bit about some analogs here on Earth that we use to figure out what to look for out there in the cosmos. And all of my talks, I always have to have the blue marble somewhere, so I figured I'd start with it here tonight. I imagine everyone watching is aware that this is the image called the blue marble taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts on their way to the moon in 1972. And it's one of those images that I think inspires all of us to remember that we are sharing this biosphere and this little world together. And for us astrobiologists, it makes us think a lot about what other inhabited worlds out there might look like. It's also a really just exceptional time right now for those of us who are considering the potential for alien life. If you think about where we are right now in the history of our species, over the last roughly 250,000 years that we've been a species, it's still less than a century since we discovered that other galaxies exist. This year is a pretty big year for space exploration. This year is the 60th year since humans went into space for the first time with Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961 on April 12th. And for those who are into partying about space, there is the Yuri's Night World Space Party happening this year on April 10th. I highly recommend checking it out. Going to be a lot of really cool things about that to celebrate the 60th year here this year, but it's also the 40th year since the very first space shuttle flight. And it's just over 20 years since we've consistently had humans in space. And so we're very much at the baby steps realm of taking a step outside of our cradle. And so for figuring out whether or not we're alone in the cosmos, we're only really just beginning there as well. We've only really just started trying to frame ourselves within the rest of the cosmos and really have only just started looking at other worlds for potential signs of life. Now, very recently, as you might all know, a very big thing happened in this realm of looking for potential signs of life out there with the landing of Perseverance on Mars. So I stole a little clip from JPL. For those who haven't seen the landing videos, I hope you have, but if you haven't, this is the image of Perseverance coming down with cameras showing the descent, and here soon we'll see some other cameras during the sky crane operation, lowering the rover down so that it can touch down on the surface, which, I mean, this is incredible. When I was a kid, I couldn't imagine having videos live coming to us from Mars showing this happening like we see in science fiction movies and television shows. And then for me, the video where the sky crane right here flies away, I mean, how groovy is that? That looks like science fiction to me. And so, yeah, a very cool moment for colleagues and friends and everyone at JPL celebrating this moment. But Perseverance is also a pretty big moment for us in astrobiology in general. It's the first mission to Mars since the Viking landers to specifically be designed to look for signs of past or present life. And so it very much is a robot astrobiologist going to Mars. And I think for a lot of us, Mars holds a very special place in our hearts. Percival Lowell in 1895, when he wrote the book Mars and made his hypothesis that there are Martian beings trying to irrigate water from the Martian poles down to the equator. And as hopefully some of you are aware, that inspired H.G. Wells to then write War of the Worlds 2 years later, which kind of launched the entire era of alien sci-fi. Mars kind of held that special place for us for a very long time in the early 1900s. A lot of people just generally assumed that there were living things on Mars, that there were seasons of plants coming and going on Mars, and there were creatures walking around the surface of Mars. It wasn't really until we sent spacecraft there with Mariner 4 and then Mariner 9, and then with the Viking landers and the many robots we've sent there since, that we learned at first that Mars appeared to be more barren and desolate. It really wasn't until 1996 with the discovery of putative microfossils in a Martian meteorite called ALH 84001 that we actually started thinking more about whether or not Mars could have had life. And that really kind of launched the realm of astrobiology as far as NASA is concerned. Before 1996, NASA had exobiology as a word for what we now call astrobiology. It wasn't until that meteorite paper came out in 96 that we changed it to astrobiology. And now we have the NASA astrobiology program, for which I host that show, Ask an Astrobiologist, and I've done lots of my work. And so Mars is kind of a really interesting case for us. There's lots of cool places in our solar system to look, but Mars is one of the most well-known ones right now. And with Perseverance, if you haven't seen any of the images or data from Perseverance, everything is being uploaded to the website at Mars 2020 at mars.nasa.gov. But they now have this really cool tracking map as well. So if you go to that URL you see up there at the top of this slide, it will take you to this map where you can zoom in and out based on orbital imagery. And you can see the path being followed by Perseverance. Now Percy hasn't driven very far yet, but you can still see the path. And as it continues moving, we're going to see a lot more of that path evolving and see some of these sampling sites we're going to go to, some of the science that the mission is going to do. Maybe they'll even drop a little pin for Ingenuity once it takes off for its first of hopefully all 5 flights. And there's a lot of reasons for us to have dropped this robot astrobiologist into this region called Jezero Crater on Mars that you see in this image. One of the big ones is that this crater appears to have been a paleo lake. That long ago, there was a large body of standing water, maybe over multiple periods of drying and re-wetting inside of the crater to allow the potential for life to have been there. But there's also a lot of really cool features that we want to explore now. So for instance, you kind of see on the left-hand side, Neretva Vallis, where it's coming into the crater right here, is an outflow channel, almost like a river, bringing fluid, but also bringing sediment and perhaps organics and perhaps signs of life, and depositing it here in this large delta structure. And so a large objective for Percy is to drive over to this delta and to start sampling some of that material. Much like deltas here on Earth, there's a lot of material that can get captured in those sediments. And so perhaps those first signs of life on Mars are waiting for us inside of those sediments. And the way that we know what to look for with Perseverance and our other missions when looking for life is by doing research on analogs, on how life functions here on Earth. I stole this image, and I have another one here in the talk as well from Aaron Gronstall. He's a geochemist and an artist. He also makes all of the astrobiology graphic histories for NASA Astrobiology. They're really cool comic books if you're into that. Some really great science, and a lot of great scientists are featured throughout all the different issues of this comic book. But here you can see Peter Doran talking about what analogs are. Searching for life on Mars starts with searching for habitats. The trick is to find places on Earth that share some of Mars's life-threatening characteristics to make an analog. And I thought that was really interesting language for a quote, because analog environments, yes, they share life-threatening characteristics, but it's also the life-supporting characteristics that make them super important for us. We went to Jezero crater because there could be life-supporting things in that crater as well, just like that paleo lake. So it's not always life-threatening that we're looking for, but it is ways in which that life interacts with the environment around it that we're considering. So for instance, one of the most talked about analogs here on Earth for Mars is the Atacama Desert, the driest desert on the planet. For the astronomers amongst us, even amateur astronomers, you probably know that there's the Llano de Chajnator Observatory. It's part of the European Southern Observatory, is located in the Atacama Desert, not in the most desolate and dry parts of the desert, but more up on the mountaintops. But there's a region of the Atacama that is extremely dry, and yet scientists doing research there have found plenty of signs of life, microbes from the soil, signs of DNA from microbes in the soil. They found regions where microbes inhabit salt in this very dry desert. They've also gone to places like this part of the desert called Yungay, which honestly, whenever I see pictures of it, always reminds me of the Viking landers and some of the pictures they took. Yungay looks very much like Mars from Viking 2. Fairly recently, a group led by Dirk Sjoesme-Koch went here and did some sampling down deep into the subsurface, and they managed to do it right after a very heavy rainfall. And so in this image, which I don't like showing too much data in talks, but in this image, you can see 3 different years here, 2015, 2016, and 2017 on all of these graphs. 2015 data are the ones on the far left for all of these. And what you're looking at here, for instance, is water content at 20 to 30 centimeters here in Area A. You can see there's a lot of water content for this desert. 3% water content's pretty high for the Atacama. It was right after a major flooding event, and you can see water going down and disappearing. Likewise, in this figure, you can see the formation of a mineral called anhydrite. That's a calcium sulfate mineral. Basically, what this is showing is that the desert is then drying out again after that 2-year period and forming a lot more of this mineral. Anhydrite forms in extremely dry environments. And so what these two figures are showing you is the decrease in water, the increase in minerals that show drying. And what they saw was a huge bloom in life. So amounts of DNA that were measured, in ATP, the activity of life, that was measured in this soil down to 30 centimeters in the Atacama Desert, showing that life blooms in a desert like the Atacama. And so it makes someone like me wonder, is that a really good analog for what might happen on Mars if we could throw a little water at the situation? Are there organisms in the near surface of Mars, perhaps even who survived for a long time in leftover refugia in oases of life, who might be able to come back? So there are some of us who are wondering, not only can we find signs of ancient life on Mars, but whether or not there's signs of extant life on Mars. And so the Atacama Desert research makes me think a lot about that. Another cool place that we're looking at on Earth to try to understand the kinds of things we might find on Mars are acid mine drainage and rock drainage areas. So this image is from the Rio Tinto River in Spain. The Rio Tinto is a region where for millions of years, iron-rich metals in the subsurface have been reacting with fluid and creating very acidic waters. And when this happens, it liberates a lot of iron that can make iron oxides and makes this blood red color. And much like Mars, gets its color from rust. Mars is colored red and brownish from the iron oxides on its surface, as well as the dust in its atmosphere. And in a region like Rio Tinto, we see that same kind of thing happening back in the rock record. We see the formation of minerals that show us that this process is happening, where iron is reacting with water and creating this acidic material. Now, in the modern day, this is actually happening due to a very large mining operation. And so it's even more than we see in the ancient rock record. We see a lot more of this formation in the modern day. And what's causing that, I mentioned here, it's acid mine drainage. this process where we have water and some oxygen or an oxidant mixing with sulfide minerals, things like pyrite in the subsurface, creating that acidic fluid, liberating metals. And here in this image, it says fish mortality. Acid mine drainage does impact the environment around it greatly. And we have acid mine drainage occurring across the planet from our mining operations. I like this figure. I know it's really blurry, but it's one that I've used in teaching geochemistry. And it mentions how old Roman mine sites in Great Britain are still producing acid mine drainage thousands of years after they were used for mining operations. And here in the US, we have more than 100,000 acid mine drainage sites. It's very common here in Colorado. Due to the heritage of mining from the gold rush here in 1859 and thereafter. A lot in California as well because of the 49ers in 1849 and thereafter. A lot of those old heritage mines where people just took off in the gold rush, staked claims, dug into the earth to mine for gold as much as they could with no restrictions and eventually no one to actually be responsible for them. And so we have a lot of these mines across the US that are producing acid mine drainage. It's impacting the environment, but it also provides a way for those of us who are interested in the production of these iron oxide minerals in these environments that are especially relevant to Mars to have test beds for studying. These produce analog environments for potential Martian environments. Another similar kind of environment like to that is in Borup Fjord Pass in the Canadian High Arctic. This is a picture of me sitting on top of a geological feature called a gossan. Gossans form in a very, very similar way to acid mine drainage, where there's an ore body with pyrite and other sulfide, iron sulfide kinds of minerals that's being leached in the near surface and producing this red rock you can see around here, iron oxides everywhere. Here's a picture from an unpublished paper, and so these are data that have not been published yet, showing some of the different minerals we find inside of this feature. So things like pyrite is there in the middle of the feature, but as we move out, we find iron oxides like goethite. And a very important one here is jarosite that forms in acidic environments. And jarosite has been implicated as a potential biosignature for Mars. We found jarosite on Mars, and it's been implicated as a way for seeing where life could be driving some of the reactions in iron and sulfur chemistry. And very quickly, again, I don't like showing lots of data in talks, but here on the right, you can see an electron microscope image showing some pyrite that's being etched. And those etchings could potentially be driven by the microbes that are thriving inside of this feature. We also see things like these filaments covered in minerals, these long sheaths. I don't have data to show that those are necessarily biological, but they do appear to be very similar to other features we find in similar environments like acid mine drainage systems, like the Atacama Desert. And so it could be an interesting sign for us to follow to look for on Mars as well. But the main reason to talk about Borup Fjord Pass here, for me, is to change the story a little bit away from Mars. I was fortunate enough to have the chance to travel here with a NASA exobiology grant with my collaborators. In this very large image, we're looking down from a cliff. If you notice in the central part of the image down towards the bottom, there's some orange dots down there. Those are our tents where our field camp is set up in this valley called Borup Fjord Pass. This valley is on Ellesmere Island in the high Arctic, about 500 miles south of the North Pole. It's very distant. It took 5 different flights to get there, including a helicopter to drop us off in the middle of this valley. And the main reason to go there wasn't to study those iron mineral features, but rather was to study something going on with this glacier. And so I'm not sure what the quality of the video is. Hopefully you can see this. There's a glacier right here running across this valley, north to south on the right-hand side of the image. And right at the base of the glacier is a large ice that looks yellow. And as it moves down the valley, you can see some of that yellow coloration starting to disappear and going to white. What we're seeing there is a region on top of this glacier where water from the subsurface is coming up through the glacial ice, and it's rich in hydrogen sulfide. It's that molecule that makes the rotten egg smell. I know people say that like it's supposed to be a bad thing, but having done a lot of research with hydrogen sulfide and loving places like Yellowstone National Park, I actually really enjoy the smell of hydrogen sulfide. And so it doesn't smell very rotten to me, but for some people it does. But where that hydrogen sulfide is coming up, it's reacting with the surface environment, specifically the oxygen in the atmosphere and the living things at the base of this glacier. And it's creating large mats of yellow elemental sulfur. If you've ever seen like sulfur mineral in like a nature store, it's these beautiful yellow crystals. This is basically the same thing. It's just not well crystallized. And a fun side story, when we were here in this image, you can kind of see at the left-hand side of the image, there's a bunch of snow and ice coming out on top of this icy area right here. This happened from a Joikelhop. It's a glacial explosion. Our very first day on the glacier, we were exploring a small lake back in this region, and I heard a rumbling. I looked over at my friend, and we were both like, what is that sound? And we turned around just in time to see what I estimated in the end was about 12 tons worth of glacial ice and water bursting out of this crevasse and filling up that entire lake region back on the back end here. Luckily, we had time to run and try to get to a safe place on some glacial tilling. But it was a terrifying experience, but it's also what we go through in doing analog research to get data. And what we found in looking at that sulfur, I found a very rare mineral form of sulfur that isn't supposed to exist in cold environments, which led me to hypothesize that if not due to life, at least due to the processes of life, specifically the production of organic materials by living things, allowed for the presence of this rare form of sulfur to exist on this glacier in the Arctic. And often what we're doing in these analog environments is just that. We're looking into how life interacts with the environment around it, what kinds of signs of those interactions we can then find in other worlds. And this site itself, Borup Fjord Pass, and again, here's another image from Aaron Gronstall's comics. This site has been implicated as one of the key sites for studying Europa. And so here you can see a few of my colleagues from over the years who've gone to that same site, sampling sulfur coming out of the glacier and this little stream of yellow material here. And, watch out where those huskies go, right? But it's a great place for us to study the chemistry that could be important to understanding what we're looking for in seeking signs of life on icy worlds. A similar site that you may have heard of before is Blood Falls in Antarctica, on the Taylor Glacier. I've not had a chance to visit this site. I would love to. It looks really cool and kind of creepy, and maybe like an H.P. Lovecraft kind of story comes to mind. This is another site where we have fluid under a glacier that's coming up through the ice and emerging at the surface and then changing its chemistry at the surface. But this fluid is rich not just in hydrogen sulfide, but also in a lot of iron. And where the iron comes out and meets with oxygen from the atmosphere, it creates that blood red iron oxide material, just like in Rio Tinto, just like the iron oxide rust on Mars. And so it creates this beautiful blood red waterfall color coming down onto the ice here. Sites like Borup Fjord Pass and Blood Falls, they give us a potential to see how the chemistry of fluids moving from below large ice structures to the top of them and how they change can teach us about what life is doing, not just at the surface, but in the subsurface as well. And again, that's a key for studying Europa. I imagine everyone watching knows what Europa is, but for those who don't, Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter. It's a very large moon, about the same size as our moon, actually. Europa has these beautiful lines crisscrossing it here on the surface, these cracked features. And when we look down at those cracked features really close, in the few high-resolution images we do have currently, we can see where they tend to shift and slide. They show a lot of features that look like there could be communication with what down below is a very, very deep ocean. The crust of Europa is an icy crust. So unlike our planet, where we have a crust of rock and then a mantle down below, Europa and several of the other icy moons have icy crusts with oceans down below. Now, we don't know exactly how thick Europa's ice shell is. The best estimates right now keep on getting close to about 10 kilometers. It might be less than that. It could be a lot more than that, maybe 40 kilometers. But it seems like 10 kilometers is a good bet given our current data. That's about 6 miles of depth of ice, which is way thicker than any ice we have anywhere on Earth. And so drilling through that much ice is going to take a lot of work, which is why it's important to study potential interactions of the fluid from Europa's ocean with its surface in places like Borup Fjord Pass and Blood Falls. And this image created by Kevin Hand that I modified a little bit just shows some of the potential features that we could see for various ways that fluids or maybe low density salty ices could interact with the surface of Europa to provide some of the current things that we see at the surface. But if there is this ocean down below, and you might notice over here, it says 100 kilometers. We don't know the exact depth, but 100 kilometers to 120 kilometers is a pretty good guess given our current data. That's about 60 to 75-ish miles. That's a very, very deep ocean. Way, way deeper than our oceans here on Earth. So the average depth of our oceans, I forget offhand right now, I think it's like 2 miles or 3 miles. It's not very deep at all. And even the deepest parts of our ocean in the Marianas Trench are still an order of magnitude less depth than what we have on Europa. And so if you took all the water in Europa's ocean and compared it to Earth, there would be far more fluid in Europa's ocean than we have in all of our oceans and lakes and rivers here on Earth, which could mean that there's a great potential for life down there in that ocean. And one thing a lot of us are wondering, could there be hydrothermal vents deep in Europa's ocean where that ocean water meets its crust? Could there be regions just like we have here on Earth, like these black smokers? Here on Earth, on the seafloor, cold seawater is seeping down into the crust down below, into the oceanic crust. And it's being heated up by the mantle down below. And in very specific areas, it's coming back up. And when it comes out, it's very, very hot and it's enriched in lots of metals. And so this provides an oasis for life as we know it. We found things like those giant tube worms, Riftia pachyptila, thriving around these black smokers, things like albino crabs, albino shrimp, very rare anemone, all kinds of microbes that are dwelling in this environment. And so maybe there's a potential that we could find some signs of life from these oases on the seafloor of Europa. And we might find that the surface, it might require drilling down and then taking a submersible down to find them. Again, the latter is a very long way out, but we do have a mission coming up very soon, which should give us more data, at least of the surface of Europa. Europa Clipper should be launching now in around October of 2024. For those who follow space news, just recently it was announced that Europa Clipper is no longer bound to SLS. And so we might actually see Europa Clipper launched on a SpaceX rocket, or even another company, if that can happen in just 3 years. I think most likely SpaceX, but it makes it more likely we're going to see Europa Clipper actually make its launch window by disentangling it from SLS. But so Europa Clipper is going to go to the Jovian system. It'll orbit around Jupiter and Europa together. It'll give us very high resolution mapping of the surface of Europa. It'll finally help us to figure out a much better estimate of the depth of the ice crust and the ocean down below. It also has instruments for studying the chemistry of the very near surface of Europa, which again, if there is some interaction with that ocean down below, there could be potential signs of life there. There might even be plumes of water erupting from this moon. We have some scant data from the Hubble Space Telescope showing hydrogen and hydroxyl bands, basically showing water from the south polar region of Europa that could be plumes. And so one of the instruments on board Clipper that's being built down the street here in Colorado, called SUDA, will be looking at dusts and ions around Europa as it's orbiting around Jupiter and Europa together and doing a flyby of Europa. This instrument will study some of the dusts and things like that around Europa. But if there are plumes of fluid, it also has the potential to allow us to fly through those plumes and to study the chemistry of those materials, which could be very cool. And if you're interested in Europa Clipper or talking about Europa, I can't help but plug my own show. Here on the 23rd of March, I'm going to have Dr. Cynthia Phillips on the show. She's a deputy project scientist for Europa Clipper, and as well as for the Europa lander concept design. And so we are going to nerd out on a whole bunch of stuff around Europa and icy worlds. A bunch of our research will certainly talk about Europa Clipper and the lander design, and what would look like actually landing a mission on Europa to study the surface and the very near surface of ice. Those are both really cool missions. The lander concept has not been approved yet, but we could actually see a lander going to Europa rather soon. If you want to tune into this, it's called Ask an Astrobiologist. We air it on seganet.org and the NASA Astrobiology Facebook page. The show usually is me for a half an hour talking with the guest, and then we have a half an hour of audience questions. So if you have questions about Europa Clipper or Europa itself or any of the science going on at JPL with icy worlds right now, that'd be a great episode to tune in for. And some of you might know we have another icy world in our solar system that has an ocean and that also has confirmed plumes of water erupting out of it. The moon Enceladus, orbiting around Saturn, it's a much smaller moon, but we got very, very lucky with Enceladus, with its erupting geysers of water coming out of its south pole here from a region called the Tiger Stripes, in that when the Cassini mission got to the Saturnian system, we didn't know that this water would be erupting. And we were lucky enough to have an instrument on board the spacecraft that we could fly through those plumes of water and get some scant data. But with that data, it's been enough for us to say that there should be a global subsurface ocean on Enceladus. And it appears that there are some of the signs of hydrothermal activity. And so Enceladus is a really cool target for us to study for astrobiology. Here's an even cooler image just showing, this is a mosaic from Cassini, just showing some of those plumes erupting and blowing fluid out from this moon. We definitely need another mission to go back to this system, to go to Enceladus to study it. There have been proposals like the Enceladus Life Finder and some others, but this is a great place to look. And if there are signs of life from hydrothermal vent systems coming from Enceladus, then that's a great place to go look is those plumes. We might have signs of life erupting into our solar system, into space for us to go sample right now. And so I'm highly supportive of any kind of mission design to make that happen. But there's also an interesting thing about looking for life from hydrothermal vent systems. A lot of people think that there's a good chance that life here on Earth started in the ocean and started around hydrothermal vents. But as much work as we're doing right now in realms of the origins of life and trying to figure out how it might have happened here on Earth or how it might happen in many other kinds of places, we still don't know exactly how life can start around a hydrothermal vent. Specifically, the fluid chemistry around hydrothermal vents can preclude the potential for the formation of some biological molecules to make it unlikely to see those molecules form. And so more recently, there's been other research suggesting that maybe life can't begin in ocean worlds. As sad as that sounds for some of us who really love places like Europa and Enceladus, maybe life requires land to get started. And so some researchers, Bruce Damer and Dave Deemer specifically, have been leading some hypotheses and a bunch of research into whether or not geothermal systems on dry land might have been the more important place to look for the origins of life. Again, it makes it sad for those of us who love Europa and Enceladus, but it also gives us another good reason to study some analog environments here on Earth. Like one of my favorites, the Grand Prismatic Spring. I actually have a picture back here on my wall behind me of Grand Prismatic Spring. It's my favorite feature in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. In this image, you can see the boardwalk going around this hot spring, people walking around it. It's rather large. The fluid coming up is around 190 degrees Fahrenheit at the center. And where it moves out to the edges, it cools down just around 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So very, very hot for us. Don't go hot potting if you've ever heard of that term. There are people who've gone into Yellowstone and thought it would be a cool idea to go for a bath in the hot springs. Some of these hot springs are easily hot enough and acidic enough to kill you. And so it's a very bad idea to do that. But while it can harm us humans, there are organisms who thrive very well in these environments. And specifically with Grand Prismatic, one thing I love about it is all of this coloration you're seeing around the outside, the greens and the yellows, oranges and reds. are being caused by pigments inside of living things. And here's an even cooler picture looking down from above where you can see that coloration everywhere. You can see some greens and reds everywhere from different kinds of pigments inside of the organisms thriving here. Pigments that protect them from the damage of sunlight, of UV radiation, as well as pigments that help them to photosynthesize, to use light as energy. And another cool thing, grand prismatic changes color throughout the year. So in the wintertime, when it's colder around the edges of the pool, there's a lot more green and a lot more photosynthesis going on. In the summertime, things get dried out and there's a lot more photoprotection. And so there's a lot more oranges and reds in the coloration of these organisms that, again, they're thriving quite well at 145 degrees Fahrenheit. And there are other creatures on our planet that can also survive very high temperatures and other extremes. For instance, this microbe is called Mythanopyrus candeleri. It's been discovered on the seafloor around a hydrothermal vent and then cultured to show that it can thrive at 122 degrees Celsius or 251.6 Fahrenheit. Just so you know, that's slightly hotter than the temperature that we use in our autoclaves in laboratories to sterilize things. So this organism could survive sterilization in the lab, at least one form of sterilization. And you'll see here too, it says 20 megapascals of pressure. To give you an idea of what that means from down on the ocean floor, our seafloor pressures get up to about 1,000 atmospheres or between 10 and 100 megapascals. So 20 megapascal is like being on the seafloor. And again, these guys were brought up from hydrothermal vents. And so not only can they stand high temperatures, they also stand high pressures as well and can thrive in those environments. And so we have names for organisms like that. For the ones that thrive at high temperature are called hyperthermophiles. So this guy right here, as well as things around hydrothermal vents and around geothermal pools. And then we also have the word barophile, things that can thrive at very high pressures relative to us. And so I thought I'd talk about a couple of other extremophiles, things that are living at extremes or at least can thrive at extremes relative to us. One of my favorites to talk about, primarily because its name is cool, is Deinococcus radiodurans. If you remember from grade school, when you learn that the word dinosaur basically means terrible lizard, even though they're not lizards, but it's still a cool name. Deinococcus means terrible berry, and radiodurans means things that can withstand radiation. So a Deinococcus radiodurans is a terrible berry who can withstand radiation, which is so cool. They have the highest record that we know of any living thing on Earth surviving radiation. They can take about 5,000 times the dose that we humans can, and they're still quite fine. They can survive inside of the fluids of nuclear reactors, for instance. And the way that we first found them was we were radiating tin cans for food preservation, and some of the cans were still going bad because these guys could survive the irradiation of tin cans. We have exposed things like Deinococcus radiodurans to the space environment outside of the space station. There's a package on the ISS called Expose, where the Biomex instrument, for instance, was an experiment for 2 years from 2014 to 2016 and exposed a whole bunch of creatures to the space environment, to the vacuum, to the cold of space to see what would happen to them. Could they survive over a long period of time of exposure? And one that easily could survive that, even though many of the individuals died, several were still able to come back to life quite fine, were the tardigrades, which is, I think, because of the more recent Cosmos special, are now everyone's favorite extremophile. And they are pretty cool. You might know them also as water bears. These guys are known as polyextremophiles because they can survive many different extremes. Tardigrades can thrive not just, they can't just survive the space environment, the super cold and the vacuum. They can survive being desiccated, having almost all of their fluid removed from themselves. And they just kind of like shell down into this clump of biomass. And then if you give them a little bit of water, they just bounce back up and they're fine. They can also survive a lot of salt. They can also survive high pressures. So they're rather bizarre creatures. And for those of us who want to look for life out there, it's good to think about things that push the limits of life as we know it. For instance, change gears a little bit here. You might have heard recent news talking about the potential for life on Venus. Here are two images. On the left is a visible light image looking at Venus. Venus is a world obscured by clouds. And so when we look at it with our own eyes, all we see is cloud. But on the right-hand side, looking with radar, we can actually see the surface. We can see variations in the rock here. So lighter colorations show where the rock is really rigid, where there's a lot of texture, and darker areas show where the rock is very smooth and very flat. And then the coloration here, so radar image data come back to us as black and white images. This image has been colorized based on data from the Venera 13 and Venera 14 landers from the Soviet Union that got some pictures from the surface of Venus before dying due to the surface of Venus, which is extremely hot and not a great place for life as we know it. The surface of Venus is around 850 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 92 times the surface pressure that we have here on Earth. So the surface of Venus is not a very friendly place for life as we know it. And honestly, most of our best hypotheses would suggest that no living thing could survive the surface of Venus. And yet recently you might have heard of some research suggesting that there could be a molecule in the atmosphere of Venus which might indicate life. And so this molecule is called phosphine. You can see in this image here, showing a phosphorus atom with 3 hydrogen atoms bound to it. That phosphine was discovered roughly midway up in Venus's atmosphere in a place where the temperatures and pressures are far more clement for life as we know it, are far better for life as we know it. The interesting thing about the potential for finding phosphine on Venus is that we don't currently have a good model for how it could get there without life. So here on Earth, we find phosphine. We can make it in the laboratory. We can make it on the industrial scale. But where we find it naturally in the environment on Earth, it's created by life. It's created by organisms. Now, to be fair, we have found phosphine in places like Jupiter and Saturn, but the chemistry and the physics in Jupiter and Saturn, these gas giants, is much different than the atmosphere of Venus. And we have good models for how phosphine can form on Saturn and Jupiter, but not for Venus. And so the authors who published that work from last fall, suggesting a detection of phosphine in Venus's atmosphere and really telling us we need to do some more work and find out if it's there and if it is, why it's there. They also very recently published a paper proposing a potential life cycle for things that could thrive in the atmosphere of Venus. And so in the larger image on the right, you can kind of see the elevation above the surface of Venus. It's around 51 kilometers up where the temperatures and pressures get very, very close to what we experience here on Earth. It's still pretty warm at 60 degrees Celsius, but it's the same pressure that we have down here on Earth at sea level. And so it's in that same middle region of cloud where the phosphine detection is supposed to be coming from. And so in this paper, they propose a life cycle where these organisms could form spores. Spores would allow them to survive harsh environments to then be wafted up into this middle layer of the atmosphere where the pressure and temperature are nicer for life to form what's called a cloud condensation nuclei, basically a little grain of dust in our atmosphere, and even a cell in our atmosphere can be the basis for the formation of clouds. And so when we have a little particulate matter in our atmosphere, it allows for the attachment of water to then condense and actually make clouds. And so maybe that's actually happening. And we have like these little cloud condensation nuclei making their own little environments for the spores to then vegetate, to make living cells that are kind of fine inside their little water envelopes in this region of the middle atmosphere of Venus, to then slowly start sporulating themselves and then fall back out of the atmosphere. It's a pretty cool paper if you're into weird life cycles and what might be possible. It's worth a read. But it also is important to talk about the debate going on actively right now in our communities about this potential finding. So that detection, or that possible detection of phosphine, came from a team using millimeter, submillimeter radio data from Venus. So looking at Venus from Earth with ground-based telescopes here on Earth, specifically the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope in Hawaii, and then down in the Atacama is ALMA, the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array, allowing them to look in this radio band and where they see this dip. So over here, the white, it comes from ALMA, the gray comes from GCMT, and where they see this dip in the data, they've inferred that one little dip to be a sign of phosphine. And that fits with spectra we have from the laboratory. However, there's been a lot of active debate that you might not have heard about in the news as much as you did the original paper. Some have said that line, that dip, is more likely due to sulfur dioxide. And we know that there's a lot of sulfur in the atmosphere of Venus. There's sulfuric acid in the atmosphere of Venus. And so sulfur dioxide should be expected in the middle atmosphere of Venus. And if that is sulfur dioxide, then that'd be easily explained. And then others have looked at the data themselves from earlier data, and they're not seeing this dip at all. And so the debate is actively ongoing in the scientific community. There are some who are being rather mean about it. Scientists are human as well, and also fallible, and can make mistakes and can be rather emotional and reactive. But a good thing that we see going on right now is there is a lot of great conversation about whether or not this phosphine finding is real, and if it is, what we should do about it. But as always, we should remember the Carl Sagan quote that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I see that I'm running a little bit late on time, so I think I won't talk too much longer. Just a few more ideas I wanted to toss your way. One is just thinking about what's possible out there. We have gas giants in our atmosphere, worlds like Jupiter. And could there be life in a gas giant? For those who are fans of the original Cosmos series with Carl Sagan, you might remember the scene with this very beautiful artwork where Carl talked about the potential for organisms to thrive in a gas giant atmosphere and what they might look like. Could they be like giant bags of gas or organisms flying through the atmosphere? Maybe more in our audience right now have watched the more recent Alien World series on Netflix, which also kind of explores some of these potential flying creatures from other atmospheres. And again, we're using these analog environments on Earth to look at places like Venus and Mars and Europa and Enceladus, but we're also thinking about some of those other worlds out there. So sure, it's less than 100 years since we found out other galaxies exist, and it's only been 20 years we've had consistent human presence in space, but it's only been a quarter of a century that we've actually had real data confirming the existence of exoplanets out there. And the number of exoplanets we keep confirming is just growing all the time. I haven't looked at it recently, but at the last I looked, it was 4,400. And that's likely to keep growing through our lifetimes. And so I noticed earlier, before we started speaking, Trisha, in her profile picture here on Zoom, was wearing a spacesuit from the Mars Desert Research Station. So I thought I'd end with a couple of quick images just to talk about some analog environments for human exploration. Because many of us have wondered, will we ever look out a window to wake up to Mars? Will you ever sit there with your cup of coffee on the Martian surface and look out and see a Martian sunrise? And so the Mars Desert Research Station is one place where many of us have been going to explore what it's like to potentially live in a Mars-like environment, how humans will react together and work together in these kinds of environments. There are now many other analog bases. There's High Seas and D Mars and F Mars. We're actually working on one right now through Amity University and Cosmic Adventures that's going to be built in India in the Ladakh region that I'm hoping to visit later this year. And I'm also super lucky in that almost every year when we're not in a global pandemic, I get the chance to go to the Mars Desert Research Station to help run this rover challenge, where undergraduate students from around the world, they build these remarkable Mars rovers, and we give them challenges. We give them challenges throughout the year in how they build the rover, and then we design a very, very difficult challenge for them. I think it's the hardest robot challenge on the planet. So there's like Lunabotics from NASA, and there's some other rover challenges, but I think ours is easily the most challenging. We do things like having them do repairs on large pieces of instrumentation, autonomous terrain navigation. We even have them drive as far as 1 kilometer away, sometimes outside of comms range. And so it's been really wonderful for me just seeing the students develop and think about these problems and develop these rovers, because a lot of these students might be helping those of us in astrobiology to use analog environments here on Earth to look for potential signs of Mars in the very near future. And so I think I'll end it with that.
Thank you, Dr. Lau. We have a few questions here. If anybody has a question, go ahead and post it in the chat dialogue and we will ask your question. The first question comes from John Pinto, and he wants to know, Did you do any work on Perseverance or
Yeah, sadly, I have not myself. I have a lot of friends who are part of the Percy team. Ken Williford, who is the deputy project scientist for Perseverance, is also a member of Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. I have a lot of friends who are doing great research there, but I unfortunately am not part of the mission team for Percy. I would love to be part of a team in the near future. I'm hoping to find some way to sneak my way into one of those teams. And it's always really cool to see just how many different backgrounds we have coming together to develop the instruments, to make these missions happen, how many engineers. And then when you see the size of a team on one of these missions, it's not just scientists and engineers. There's a lot of people working in business administration and public relations and all kinds of things who are making these missions happen. And they're getting bigger and bigger and cooler all the time.
Nice. Next question. Is Mono Lake another analog?
It's a great question. Yes. Mono Lake is a really interesting analog in California. Those watching, if you've heard of Mono Lake before, it most likely happened a few years back, actually, I guess maybe more than a decade now. There was an announcement that there was a potential for life, for thriving microbes in Mono Lake to be using arsenic to substitute into their DNA backbones, taking the place of phosphorus in their backbone of their DNA. That research was very highly debated. And since it was first published, it's become more accepted that it's unlikely that was happening. But the reason for that is that Mono Lake presents a highly saline, very salty lake environment, very dry around its edges, but it's also enriched in arsenic. And so that's one reason for looking at Mono Lake as a potential analog for beings that could thrive in high arsenic, heavy metal kinds of environments. Much like we have that acid mine drainage environment that we're looking for with heavy metals and acids and things like that, Mono Lake gives us another very cool analog system to study. And there are many around the planet. I also had many other pictures. I just realized we're going kind of long on time here, so I skipped a bunch of things, but there are things like the Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan. It's known as the doorway to hell, where we have natural gas fire burning for decades. There are very cool environments like that all around our planet for us to study as analogs to see how life thrives in very extreme environments.
Okay, I like Doorway to Hell might be a cool band name. I am going to write that down. Next question. What's the pressure at the bottom of Europa's crazy deep oceans, and is there an Earth analog for it?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer offhand. That's one that I actually should know that, but I don't. So you might have to Google that for me. And let me know what the pressure is like down at the bottom of its ocean. But remember, I mentioned Europa's roughly close to the same size as our moon. And so even though it has a very deep ocean that has more fluid than all the fluids that we have in our oceans on Earth, it's also got a much lower gravity, and it's a much smaller world than our planet. But I don't know the number offhand, and I wouldn't want to guess because I'd probably get it wrong.
Roger that. Okay. Next question from Mauricio. Has there been a single repeated detection of the I'm butchering the name here. Sorry, guys. Phosphine on Venus, or was it that just the first time?
Very good question. And so like I mentioned in those data, they used two different telescopes. And so for the first one they found was using JCMT, the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope. And the lead author, Jane Greaves, was really involved in getting that time and securing it to look at Venus, and made that detection of a possible line in the spectra showing that dip that could be indicative of that molecule phosphine. But James Clerk Maxwell, the telescope, doesn't have as good of a resolution as something like ALMA. So ALMA is a very high resolution radio telescope. And so using ALMA with far more precision, they get much better data, and they were able to also show that dip. But like I mentioned, there's a lot of debate over how they analyzed their data and how they prepared the data, and then the inferences they made from it. And so there's a lot of active debate right now. And actually at our organization, Blue Marble Space Institute of Science, one of our scientists is on the original paper suggesting the phosphine presence, and has been on that one suggesting a life cycle for organisms. Another one of our researchers in our organization was on the more recent paper saying that there is no data whatsoever to support a dip being there, and there is no phosphine or sulfur dioxide data there. And so it's cool because like in science, you have this happen where not only is there active debate, but there's debate amongst scientists who work for the same organizations.
Interesting. It looks like Frank Googled it, and it looks like the pressure is 19,500 psi.
Thanks for looking it up.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and give you the last question of the evening, and that is, what is next on your adventure list? What are you up to now?
So much. Well, so I mentioned with analog stations. So my friend Siddharth Pandey, he is the director of the Amity Center for Excellence in Astrobiology from Amity University in Mumbai. His university are building a Mars analog base in Ladakh, in the Kashmir region of India. And I'm very hopeful to head out there this year for a few weeks to help teach. They're developing a program for exploring Earth and space science in this very remote region of India. I'm hoping to have a chance to go out there and teach and do some work with the students in understanding the environment, the geochemistry of the environment out there. I haven't been there yet myself, so I'd love to go explore and maybe see, what there is to kindle some interest and maybe do some research on a few fun things. I do a lot of science communication, so I host that show for NASA Astrobiology and SegaNet. I also mentor a lot of students. We have the Young Scientist program at our organization where we bring on summer interns. And so I've had a lot of interns who I've mentored through various projects in communicating science and also doing research through the Center for Life Detection from NASA Ames on a current project that we're working on to build a repository of biosignatures, of signs of life, to help us in developing future missions to look for life out there. It's good for us to know what the appropriate signs of life actually are. And actually, in that vein, there's a few of us right now who are working on developing a standards of evidence workshop to help us determine some standards before someone jumps the gun and publishes a paper claiming they found a sign of life on Venus or in an interstellar object visiting us. We need some standards of the evidence and also standards for how we report together as a community, so that we can support each other when certain people are taking it too far, or when journalists are highly misreporting what's actually being said by the scientists.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming this evening. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. And if anybody has any questions, I posted Dr. Lau's contact info and his Twitter, so feel free to reach out. And with that, I'm going to go over and hand it to Richard.
That was very interesting. And you're a great speaker too, very energetic. I like that. Okay, so next up on our agenda is our member Astrophotos and Sketches. Let me get my thing going here. And so we're going to start off with Mauricio, who sent us 3 images. If you're on, I'll just bring these up one time, and you can tell us a little bit about.
Hey, Richard, it sounds like you're falling into a black hole. I think you're having some internet issues.
Yeah, I'm getting that too. I was worried it was just on my.
Oh, I haven't shared.
Oh, there
It's
you go.
important you press that
that's much
last
better.
button, right?
Okay, that's perfect.
Mauricio?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Oh, looks like we lost Richard there.
Oh, we did. He poofed.
Yeah, let's give him a second to come back on. He's
All
probably
right,
just
hang on.
rebooting his app.
I see he's coming in now. think.
That was pretty scary, though. It did sound like he was falling into a black hole.
Oh, I think, Richard, you're muted. We had our internet go out completely here on Merritt Island for a good portion of the day, so technology is failing us. Maybe I can.
All right.
There you go.
I think I might be back. Hope
Eric wants to know how we can get that special audio play.
Your bandwidth is low.
That filter, yes.
All right, that's better.
Okay, take it away.
Okay, can you share your screen again?
I guess it dropped that. And my internet connection is unstable.
I see your moon.
Thanks for telling me that, computer. All right, let's see if we can get through this. All right.
Okay, there we go. All right, so this is an image I took when I was out with. I'd gone out with one of our newest members, Roz, to the Little Big Econ site, and it was just the two of us. He hadn't even looked through a telescope, so I wanted to give him a chance to. And we didn't have the best night, honestly. It got cloud. We had 30 minutes of clear skies, and then it got cloudy. But I did manage to capture this image of Orion, just with my camera on a wide-angle lens on a tripod. And it's just a great reminder of how you can have a really kind of crummy night, but sometimes you can make the best out of it. And my sister actually told me that this is her favorite image that I've shown her of a star field. So it's kind of it was an interesting comment to me coming from someone who isn't into astrophotography, that this sort of cloudy sky with the stars coming through was their favorite, because it gave them a kind of that extra quality.
Cool. All right, here's another one of yours.
Okay, so this is a photo I captured on my cell phone, looking through a Celestron 8 SE, and this was on our Lake Jessup event night with the scouts. And so this was the image that they were seeing on the cell phone I had on displays, which is how we were doing it for the events for COVID safety. And the moon fit perfectly on my phone's screen, so it was the perfect size for them to view it. So I just had to take a quick picture, and yeah, it's just a great example of what you can do with a cell phone adapter. And I actually had some success just before we wrapped up our events for last year, taking moon pictures with the public cell phones back when it was safe to do so. And it's definitely something that I'd like to do in the future again.
Cool. Yeah, I know at my outreach events, taking a photo through the cell phone is a real crowd pleaser. Everybody goes home with a picture.
They get really excited. They get really excited because then they have their own copy. All right, so this last picture is an image I took of Canis Major. And this was at our, again, at Little Big Econ. And this was on a night where we actually had a few more people come out. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this one I took with a 50 millimeter lens with a camera on a tripod. And I did 3-second exposures. And oops, looks like we went to the next image there.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. But I took it, I did about, let's see, I think I did about 160 3-second exposures and stacked them in a free stacking software called Cyril. And turns out, you can get some pretty decent results with just a camera and a tripod. And to anyone watching, if you're really interested in astrophotography, and maybe you see some of Frank's pictures or Derek's or Richard's, and it feels like, oh, this is something that I want to try for myself, but I don't have that kind of expertise or even the equipment. There's really no reason that you can't go out with a camera and a tripod and take some beautiful like star field pictures of just, you know, focusing on the constellations, because there's so much beauty there in a wide angle picture. You don't even need a tracking mount if you know how to just kind of cheat a little bit and just take shorter exposures but take more of them, and then you get a free stacking software, and you know, you're golden. There's so much you can do, and that's just something I'm really trying to share with people who might be kind of too intimidated to try this on their own, or even just share their pictures, because they're not as elaborate as some of the others in the club.
That's great. Constellation photography. That's a great way to get started. Really is.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up is Bill Castro with his sketches, and Frank, we may need to give Bill presentation permission.
Bill, you should be able to talk now.
We're all going to get this Zoom thing down pat to where we're experts, and then we'll stop doing it completely.
Right, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right, there's a sketch I did of M44 in Cancer. It's a nice big object for either binoculars or a wide field view telescope. And I drew that with my 130 millimeter refractor. You can see the details on the right. The text that I wrote handwritten was not all that great, so I typed it in next to it so you can read all the details. But the thing is, usually I'm looking at this thing with binoculars or the finder scope or a wide field, rich field scope. But then I was reading a Sue French article, and she talked about a couple of multiple star systems in there. So you can see here is the circled area. This is kind of like Corvus the Crow asterism. These four stars stand out. Mm-hmm. And then you go out to that point, and it looks, carry that further, you can think it looks like the horns in Taurus the Bull. But right here is a multiple star system. That's one, and then there's the other one. And I never thought to look at it in high power. So the sketch below is looking at that in high power, and you get some bonus stars when you go to higher power, especially when you're in light pollution. You increase your signal to noise ratio when you're visually observing. So that one popped out, and then this one popped out as well. So just give you something to think about when you're looking at these things. There's always something inside of it going on too. That was pretty neat. And I did draw a little faint line where north is, if you want to do position angles. I'm kind of getting into double stars, and I'll be starting to measure that. And position angle is basically the angle of the secondary star with regards to its primary, and that goes counterclockwise, but in a refractor with a mirror image, like a diagonal or a Schmidt-Cassegrain, you'd be going clockwise, and how many degrees going around the clock there. So there you have it, and that's all the details on the right. That one, just the main stars are shown in there, because there's a ton of stars. I got tired of drawing that thing. That wore me out.
Great job, Bill. Thank you for sharing with us. Fantastic. We have some sketchers in the club. The final image is my image. This is my M101, or the Pinwheel Galaxy. And this is actually my first image from a remote site that I'm involved with out in the desert in California. So we've got a nice refractor on a Paramount and a computer that I set up, and I can dial in with TeamViewer and image. And I collected this data over 3 different nights. I did some HA when the moon was up, just to bring out some of the star forming regions in the arms. Then I did a night of luminance, and I did some RGB. So it's about 10 hours total, spread over 3 nights, shot in and out of the moon and in between clouds. It's a fun way to shoot when you just get on TeamViewer and everything is all set up. So I might be cheating a little bit, but I did help set the system up, so it's not like I'm buying data from a data farm somewhere. And let's see, it's 21 million light years away. Some facts about it, and it is located near the end of the handle of the Big Dipper, or Ursa on social media. Just Dipper because most people is, although we all know the difference between an asterism and a constellation. And that's actually all of the member Astrophotos I have for this week. Dark Sky site, and that goes out. At least they will be able to keep talking and won't need me to be showing something. So I'm gonna let you guys take it away. Mauricio?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, cool. All right. But yes, so we have been having some really great success in just getting some members together to go out to dark sites and just do some observing, some basic astrophotography. Sometimes I see that it'll be a clear night and I really want to go out to a nice dark place and do some observing, but what I found is have trouble kind of psyching myself up to go out to these dark places alone, by myself and do this. Plus, we're always talking about how bad of an idea that is to go by yourself. So I've been getting into the habit of just kind of letting people know through the chat, through Groups.io, through Facebook, when I'm going out to certain sites. And to my surprise, quite a few people have been coming out. We've had 2 really successful nights at the Little Big Econ parking area. We've had usually about 6-7 people come out. And I think my favorite surprise about the whole experience is being able to kind of help out some members with either their photography, like the member Roz I mentioned earlier. He's really excited about astrophotography, and so I was able to help him, take some kind of more simple photos of constellations and show him how to get focus with live view. And then we had Elaine come out, and she brought her first new telescope that she hadn't really fully figured out yet because of COVID, right? Because she was having Justin help her out with that, and that kind of stopped happening once the pandemic started. So I had made the incorrect assumption that just because she was had been a member for a few years now, that she was like as experienced as anybody else with this whole thing. And so I'm really excited about the possibility of having more members come out that maybe, don't have their own scopes, or maybe they're interested in getting started with photography, or maybe they just haven't figured out their telescope yet. And it'd be really great to have more and more people come out safely. Of course, we're all wearing masks and everything. But just to, just have more fellowship in the club, and just help people get more excited about it. And so I was glad you guys mentioned earlier that we're trying to do this thing for the Messier Marathon this Saturday, and the weather's actually looking better than it was before. So I need to check in with Len, see how we're looking at that. I'm probably going to post again on the on Groups.io and Facebook just as a reminder. But yeah, this is definitely something that I'd like to continue doing. And it'd be great to see other people do it as well. Whenever you're going out to a site, just let people know. And if you'd like company, of course, but it seems like it's just a lot more fun when you have a group of astronomers that want to do it with you. So that's it.
Elaine, you go ahead and jump in.
Okay, guess it's my turn now. I really want to thank Mauricio, I had kind of a breakthrough with him the first night out at Little Big Econ. I got my telescope shortly before the COVID shutdown. And as he said, Justin was helping me, but then we couldn't get together, and Justin has moved. And the way I learn, I needed the kind of hands-on and demonstration. And I went out a second time and pretty much got things put together by myself. And I had to keep running over to Bill Castro. Okay, what should I go look at now? Because I was finding things, and it was really quite an experience. And I have a little more information. Can I have screen sharing? I have a little more information for those of you who want to know what we're doing out there and how they can join in. So my in the news for March, the area that Mauricio's talking about is the Little Big Econ State Forest, the Barr Street Trailhead. This is the original parking lot here with the P. They have pretty much almost tripled it in size. It now goes down to this browner field area. And we've just been setting up off to the side, close to the parking, and had some great viewing. As I posted, though, when I got the permit, I found out they are putting some lighting in that parking lot. The reason is there are some campsites over in here on the Florida Trail, and people will be leaving their cars there all night. And for security reasons, they're putting some lights in. I don't know how much of the parking lot they're going to light, but we did discuss that there's this group of trees, and they do keep a pathway mowed. So there's a possibility we can just move a little bit further from the parking and still have good dark skies. And we'll need to investigate that in the future. So that's the Barr Street Trailhead. I did go around to the other side of the Little Big Econ State Forest, which is off of Snow Hill Road. This 13 is Snow Hill Road that runs up to Geneva. The main forestry office is here where the green pin is. And if you drive in with the building on your right, go between the service areas, there's a picnic pavilion here in the back with parking. And as you can see, it's clear around that. I could not tell how dark it was going to be because the night I went was the night that had a very big full moon. There were a few, oops, skipped ahead. There were a few lights here on the office, but they weren't very bright. But this is somewhere we might want to investigate. I know some people were going to the equestrian lot here out by the road and had some pretty good luck there. But perhaps here back further away from the road will turn to work out well, and you don't have to watch where you're going to step as much in that area. All right, and Mauricio's also been out to Seminole Ranch. This is Fort Christmas Historical Park in Christmas, across the street from the fire station where I used to work. This is Wheeler Road that goes down to Orlando Wetlands Park. And right across from the entrance to Orlando Wetlands Park is a trailhead for Seminole Ranch. And as you can see, this is a big open field. Now, Mauricio did say that it's kind of isolated. It is quite isolated, but perhaps if we're getting a group of people together, this is another option. Also, I have connections with the management at Orlando Wetlands Park, and I can look into the option of this little feature. Orlando Wetlands does close at dark, but perhaps there would be a way to gain access to the public restrooms. Oops, going backwards. And then what I'm working on is Rock Springs Run State Reserve. And most of you have probably not even heard of it, but that is part of the Wekiva River Basin group of parks. Wekiva Springs State Park is down to the south off the bottom of this picture. Then the river divides the areas, and north of the river is Rock Springs Run Reserve. Running along the top of the picture here is State Road 46. Right here on the upper edge is Seminole State Forest, the Bear Pond Trailhead, for those of you who are familiar with that. Or down here on the right side, this is the Wekiva River. So it's just across the Wekiva River on State Road 46. And the area I was looking at is down here around the horse stable. They do have a riding stable here, but as you see, that is surrounded by a lot of open land. I have not had an opportunity to talk with the state parks people yet. I do have a very good relationship with them. I will speak to them and I will get back to you about that. And a feature here at the riding stable, because there's camping in the area, is also restrooms. So that's another possibility for the future. I've put the addresses down here. This is being recorded, so you will have access to the addresses. And as you can see, they're a little bit spread out: Oviedo, Geneva, Christmas, and Sorrento. But you know, anything with a 5-digit numerical is probably kind of remote and might be a good dark sky bet. And as you can see, Seminole Ranch and Rock Springs Run both have 5-digit numericals. So good options. On a slightly different note, a bit about the Golden Well Hotel in Prague. This is built into the side of the hill below Prague Castle. It has a fabulous location in Prague, spectacular views, fabulous room service. The rooms are wonderful. It was originally built in the 16th century and still has some 17th century walls. And here's a picture of the exterior. Here's the Golden Well Hotel. And this is Prague Castle up on the top of the hill. So a fabulous location. And as I said, the rooms are really, really nice. I had the opportunity to stay here, I guess it's about 15 months ago now, just before the pandemic. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, they had a former, rather famous resident, Tycho Brahe. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but he was the court astronomer and mathematician to the Holy Roman Empire Rudolph II. And he lived in this particular building back during his lifetime. And they had a private entrance to the palace through the hotel gardens. And in memory, there is one of the guest rooms named for him and another for one of his contemporaries. Now, neither of these was my guest room, but I just found it interesting that the hotel room's named for astronomers. Okay, stopping my share.
That's
so
awesome.
Mauricio and I have additional information, and I have a little bit of homework to do on some of the dark sky places, but we will let you know how that's going. A little closer to home than KPP and Ocala.
Thank you, Elaine and Mauricio. You guys have been really blazing the trails here lately. It's really great. Okay, so next up, second to last, if I can press the right buttons and my internet will stay alive long enough, I'm going to do just a minute on the moon. Just a minute on the moon. This week's minute on the moon is on Posidonius. Posidonius is a crater located on the northeastern area, and it sits right on the shore of Mare Crisium, or the Sea of Chryses. Zooming in a little bit here, you can see it's 60 miles wide, and it's named after a Greek geographer who lived from 135 to 51 BC. Here's a photo of mine where the sun was quite high. You can see the crater has some interesting features in the middle of it, including a little crater in the center. It's about a mile and a half deep, which is actually pretty shallow here. And that's because it's one of the many craters on the moon whose floors were flooded with lava. This image is simulated using LRO data, and it shows better the rills and crater walls on the eastern side of the crater. And the crater in the middle is also flooded in its floor, and it's called Poseidonus A. This is actually a common feature of lunar nomenclature, with smaller craters being given lettered designations and named for larger features nearby. So there's all kinds of, we all know Tycho and Kepler, but there's also Tycho A, B, and C, and Kepler A, B, and C, and these are the smaller features, smaller craters around it. Poseidonus is a real treat in the eyepiece and makes a very satisfying photographic target as well, if you can catch it. And that is just a minute on the moon. Next month, we'll talk about the crater Clavius, and if you get a chance to look at it or photograph it or sketch it, please send them along so we can share with everybody, and I'll have more to say about this crater next month. And that's a minute on the moon. So, John Pinto, you're up. Promise not to talk very long.
Very good.
Stop sharing.
I will probably be more than a minute on spring equinox. Okie dokie. So in a couple days, probably in about a week or so, we're going to be celebrating the spring equinox, or some people like to call it the March equinox. We're not being hemispheric biased here, because in the southern hemisphere, it is the autumn equinox. So how would we know when it is going to occur? So again, as I've done in the past, I don't try to program this, though you can, or create a little spreadsheet to do these calculations. I try to do things that, you only need a little calculator to calculate for yourself. So again, we're going to be talking about calculations. So, those of you who are math phobic, I am sorry. But we do have to make a few assumptions so that this doesn't become an hour-long talk. So you need to know where Pisces is. I'm going to be talking about that for a minute. Something called coordinated universal time. That's how we keep track of time here in astronomy. Ecliptic longitude and celestial equator. That's kind of how we are going to define what it means to be the equinox. Something called the first point of Aries. And we're going to be calculating Julian day numbers. That's another very common time measurement that we use in astronomy. And of course, I'm going to try to keep this to a Florida-based, so that cuts down on some of the calculations that you might have to do if you were looking somewhere else. So exactly what is the spring equinox? There's a couple of different definitions. A very common one you'll hear is it's the day when the sun rises at 6 and sets at 6. Well, turns out here in Orlando, that's not true. Another common definition is the day with equal number of daylight hours and nighttime hours. And again, that's not quite true because of when the sun rises or when the sun sets. We actually see it for a little bit longer than when it actually physically sets because of refraction of the atmosphere. So even that doesn't quite cover it. So what do? We actually use something called the ecliptic longitude, which is when the sun reaches a certain point in the sky. And this point currently is in Pisces. And that point is also called the first point of Aries, because a long time ago, this point, because of precession, was in the constellation of Aries, but now it's in the constellation of Pisces. And it is when the sun crosses the celestial equator, going from south to north of the celestial equator. And the other interesting fact, and for some of you who are hikers and need to know where's east and west, this is the day, along with the autumn equinox, when the sun will rise due east and it will set due west. So that's the definition we'll use. And we will again be using a simple approximation that'll be accurate at least until the year 2080. I think that'll be long enough for us. And our accuracy is going to be plus or minus 20 minutes as the years go by. So I want to just illustrate a little bit of what this is in the sky. So let me turn on my little pointer here. All right, so here's the sun in the winter. This is the celestial equator. Basically, it's just a projection of the Earth's equator onto the sky. And in the winter, the sun is below that part of the sky. And as the winter progresses and we get closer to spring, it gets closer and closer and closer to the celestial equator. This is what we call the ecliptic, which is just basically the track of the sun against the sky throughout the year. As it's coming on its way north and it crosses that celestial equator, that is the first point of Aries, the vernal equinox. This is the day we're trying to calculate. When does the sun get here? And just to continue, as the sun keeps moving around the ecliptic, in the summer, it's north of the equator. At its highest point, it's the summer solstice, which we'll probably calculate when we get to June. And as it comes back down and crosses the equator again, we're at the autumnal equinox. And then repeats it again year after year. So this is what we're going to calculate. When does the sun get to this point? So how do we do this? We calculate the Julian day number of this spring equinox. That actually turns out to be the simplest part of this whole process. We then have to convert that, excuse me, to universal time. And then we convert it to our local Florida clock time. This third step actually takes the longest, just because it's, you'll see. So let's calculate the Julian day number of the spring equinox. That is the formula. If you can calculate that formula, you know when the spring equinox occurs. So what is that? We need to calculate this thing called the MF, which is the millennial factor. Based on, since we're only doing through 2080, we just need to look at the last two digits of our year and compute this number. It's not even a computation, it's more like create this number. 0.0 in the last two digits of the year. So let's go ahead and see how that looks. So for 2021, there's our 21. So our millennium factor is 0.021. We throw that into our formula, calculate it out, add it up. That is when the spring equinox occurs. Now, if you had a JD calendar, you're all set. Well, the AAVSO gives us a very nice Julian day calendar we can all print out and hang up on our wall. So in March, that turns out to be March 19th. Now, Julian days start at noon and go through noon on the next day. So by us calculating this 9293, we know that the spring equinox is going to occur somewhere between the 19th and 20th universal time. So now let's do that. Let's convert this to universal time. You can do this in a number of ways. You can, again, look at your JD calendar like we just did. Or you can go to that same AAVSO website, run the calculator page, and it'll calculate it for you. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. Or you can manually calculate it, which is what we're going to do. So if you went to that AAVSO web page, you would put the JD number in here with all the decimal places, click convert to universal time, and it would come out for you here. But if you want to do it manually, here's how you do it. You first need to know the Julian day number for the beginning of the year. Now, you could calculate it as what I'm going to show you, or there's many publications that'll tell you what that is for the beginning of the year, for the beginning of the month. But this is how you calculate it, at least for this century. You take this number, you take 365.25, which is the number of days in the year, take the year minus 1, multiply it out, truncate it, add it to this, and you will know the Julian day number for the beginning of the year. So let's go and do it. There's our year, 2021. We subtract 1 out of it, get 2020, multiply it by 365.25. Comes out to this number. You truncate it. In our case, we didn't really have to truncate it. Didn't have any decimal places, but if it did, get rid of it. Add it to this number here. And that's the Julian day number for the beginning of 2021. And if you're doing these calculations throughout the year, you only have to calculate this once, stick it in your notebook, and just always refer to it. So the next thing we need to do is calculate the Julian day number for the beginning of March, because we know that the equinox always occurs in March, at least right now it does. So we need to calculate the JD for the beginning of March. And again, that's fairly simple once you've calculated the beginning of the JD for the beginning of the year. So we take that JD of the year we just calculated and we add something called the days into the year for the month. And this is the month 3. It's either 59 or 60, depending on whether it's a leap year or not. So again, 2021 is not a leap year. So our days into the year we're going to use is 59. Add that to our JD number for the beginning of the year we just calculated. And March, the beginning of March, JD's number is this number here. We'll be coming back to that very shortly. Okay, so we now need to calculate when that UTC is for the spring equinox. All we have to do is take the JD we started with, we calculated right at the beginning, and just subtract it from the JD for March. So here we go. That was the number we had first calculated for the spring equinox. This was the JD for March. So this again tells us that this is going to happen UTC, Universal Time, on the 20th, 0.39969 hours, or days, actually. Now we just convert that to Florida time and we're done. How do we do that? We take the universal time and we subtract our time zone factor, because obviously we live in Eastern time here. And again, it depends on whether we are in daylight savings time or not for March 20th. This year, March 20th is in daylight savings time, so we're going to use the daylight savings time factor of 0.16667. There's our time zone factor. We subtract it from the UTC we calculated, and we know now that that is when the spring equinox is going to occur here in Florida on the 20th, 0.23302 in March. Now, of course, none of us have a clock that works on fractions of a day, so now we need to calculate it, convert it to a standard 24-hour clock like we have on our walls. This is fairly tedious, and most of you probably already know how to do this, but I'm just going to walk this through real quick. So we take that number we just calculated, truncate it, and that gives us our day. So we already know it's the 20th. We now have to calculate what part of the day. We subtract out that 20 and multiply it by 24 to get our hours. So it's going to be somewhere around 5 o'clock in the morning. And we need to now figure out what minute. We subtract the 5 off and we get the fractional hour, multiply that by 60, round it, and we get 36 minutes. So all the way at the end of this, we're calculating that the spring equinox occurs somewhere around March 20th at 5:36 a.m. plus or minus 20 minutes. If you have a calendar that tells you exactly when it is, high precision, it would tell you it calculates out at 5:37 a.m. So we were pretty darn close on this one. I always like to make a slide that just shows the entire calculation from beginning to end, so you can kind of follow along if you're doing it on your notebook. And if you want to learn more and do more calculations or learn more about this particular calculation, I recommend this book as a starting book. And if you get more ambitious, I recommend that book. Really ambitious, this book. And when you're ready to have a PhD in astronomical calculations, you want this book. If you want to go ahead and start calculating the other solstices and equinoxes for the rest of the year, these are the factors you're going to need and the days into the year that you're going to need. But it's the basic same calculation, just different formulas and different days into the year. And that's it. Open to any questions or throw it back to you, Richard.
Thanks, John. I am still around. My internet has held up. I'm going to skip the video though to preserve bandwidth. First, I have to confess an errata to my presentation. Thank you, John, for waking me up on that. The seashell-shaped Maria is the Sea of Serenity, not the Sea of Crises. So bear that in mind. And that actually does conclude our CFAS meeting for this month. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think we had a pretty good presentation and mini programs. Our next meeting will be on April 14th. And between now and then, I'll see you on the internets. And good luck and clear skies, everybody.